morning. Thank you for coming on the first session after the party. I know that's always a challenge, so you're brave, and thank you for coming. I'll introduce myself kind of as we go through the presentation. Asanka asked me to give a talk on open source at this conference. And of course I said, yes, I'd always love to come to Barcelona. Last time I was here was in our 2014 WSO2Con, which was a really great event as well. And Asanka asked me to talk on open source. And I didn't really just want to give another boring talk on open source, which is like, what is open source and why is it good? What is it? Why is it good? I certainly have given many talks like that over the years, even including last year's WSO2Con in Miami. So I needed to come up with some kind of a new perspective on open source, something that might be interest, especially maybe to some of the younger colleagues and engineers in the industry who they already have a good understanding of the basics of open source. But I realized I have something that a lot of my younger colleagues don't have, which is the age. I'm just getting older. And when you get to my age, you realize that a lot of your ideas have had to evolve and change over time. They become obsolete. You change your mind many times. And you've been forced to look at problems from many different perspectives. And so today I was hoping I could share some of the experience I've had in the software industry and in open source to show that open source isn't just something that's simple and static, but in fact, there's got a lot of different aspects to it, and it's constantly changing in its forms and in the role in the software ecosystem. So since I'm going to share from some of my experience, I wanted to kind of introduce some of my credentials. So I'm coming up on 50 years, actually, of acquaintance with personal computers and the industry. And I've had a lot of roles in the industry, from simply being a programmer, of course, to a startup founder, product designer. And in the late 1990s, I started working for Microsoft developing open standards. And that's where I met Sanjeeva and some of the other crew that started WSO2. And I joined WSO2 in 2006, which I can't believe it's that long ago. It's gone very quickly. And that was really my first deep dive into the world of open source. And for the last few years, I like to describe my job as kind of the steward of WSO2's business model around open source. So what kind of licensing decisions we make, how we package up the services we offer, how do we differentiate free use of our software from paid use of our services, and how do we balance that desire to provide free access to our software for people who need it, and use that to help spread our software through the world, but still have a clear additional value which we can monetize and build a successful business from. So, as like I said, every open source, primer talk focuses on what open source is and why it's good. And I think you can just ask GPT and you'll get probably as good an answer as I could give on that. But looking back over my career, it seems to me that the more important question is who is using open source. So I thought today I would actually, instead of talking about what open source is and why directly, I'm going to talk about who is using open source. And from that, you can really see how that determines from who is using it, why they're using it, and kind of what form the open source takes. And so we can kind of use this to see how open source has influenced the software industry. And so for the sake of the presentation, I'm going to define some kind of archetypes of different constituencies who have adopted open source and map them over a decade of over the last 5 decades of software industry, which I have some experience in, and show how open source has evolved, who has kind of joined the ecosystem, and how it's influenced the industry as a whole. So at the start of the timeline, it's actually hard to imagine when I was looking into it, but it was only in 1980 that the US government definitively placed computer code under US copyright law. So this really gave some structure to the development of software licenses, and it also spurred the creation of the first open source licenses. And so roughly each decade, We've seen new constituencies joining the open source ecosystem, and I've kind of given them some names, starting back in the 1970s and 1980s with the hobbyists and the academics, and then moving on into the 1990s with what I'll call the DIYers, the do-it-yourselfers, and then the disruptors, evolving into the peddlers. And now we're seeing kind of the reemergence of community organizing around open source. And with all this in mind, we'll try and kind of predict maybe what the next decade holds. And I see, especially regulators becoming more interested in open source. So, of course, this vastly oversimplifies open source and history, but for the purposes of presentation, it gives me kind of an organizing principle, hopefully, that will be engaging for you. So, let's start off. And actually, if I'm going to start all the way back in the 80s, I'll kind of dive into my own history. In the mid-1970s, my father and my brother bought their first microcomputer kit. It was a 6502-based kit. It had 1K of memory, not 1 meg, not 1 gig, 1K of onboard memory. And my father taught physics at the university level and had some access to some computer equipment as well. And the university also hosted an early computer hobbyist club. And so we joined there right as these new personal computers were emerging in the hobbyist community. And at the time, writing software meant writing in assembly language. You'd write out your assembly language, then you'd hand code it, hand compile it into hexadecimal, and then you could load it into the computer either through a little keypad or using a machine like a teletype here. This is a ASR 33 teletype. So this is my brother, probably about 1976, and you can see he's been loading some software into the computer, which is in the background. It didn't even have a box; it was just a board at the time. And the paper tape he's holding, this was generated by the teletype, and it was the only way that you could get information in and out of the computer. So as you typed, it would generate paper tape, or if the computer typed back, it could generate paper tape, or you could run the paper tape back through the teletype, and it would simulate typing into the computer. So that was the only permanent storage that we had at the time. I remember the first program I wrote was a little routine just to do some math, but the 6502 instruction set had an add instruction. It only operated on 8-bit values. So my first routine gave me 16-bit addition. So it's extremely rudimentary at the time. And the computer club, and there were a few very janky hobbyist magazines as well, but that was really the main source of information and inspiration that we had at the time. And there really wasn't any commercial software available for these new microcomputers. So what you created, you would share freely among the hobbyist community. And that's how you discovered new software. That's how you promoted your software. Couldn't do very much with the software, but it was easy to share. So my brother and my father actually recognized that there was this gap in how to get software shared. And they started a small business called the 6502 Program Exchange. And this extended the possibilities of sharing software within their local computer club to a mail order business that could share with people outside the area. And you could buy this software either on a paper tape, or you could buy it in source code form, and it cost 25 cents per page, which was really just the Xerox copy. So right there in the name, you see it wasn't about selling software, it was about exchanging software. And we were fortunate. The company really had no financial goals at all. It fit in really well with the industry at the time, which was very much a hobbyist-based industry. Its purpose was to meet interesting people, build a larger community, and gain some interesting experience for us as students, my father as an educator. So my brother and my father signed up to exhibit at the first West Coast Computer Fair in 1978, I believe it was. And that was a legendary computer fair. This was the launch of the Apple II, the first Apple II. And this is a photo my mom took of the floor the show floor. I actually had created a little device to help you wind up your paper tape quickly. So it was kind of my first attempt at product design. And so this is the booth. I just want to kind of show how much of a hobbyist enterprise it was. They had the handmade banner. I think it was made out of felt they cut out and glued on the banner. And the binder here on the table, that's probably the product. That's all of the software they had available. You could actually come up and look at it and say, oh, this looks interesting. Can I have a copy of that? And you could buy it for 25 cents a page. And that price really wasn't even a license fee. I don't even know if they had a license on this stuff. I doubt it. The intention of the company wasn't to make money, but to exchange software among the community. And so one more picture. This is actually me on the right. This is the second West Coast Computer Fair the next year. And you can see we'd upped our game. We had a bunch of new product announcements pinned to our banner. We had an Apple II actually in the corner so we could demonstrate some of the software. And of course, we'd upped to ties. So maybe this gives you a little sense of what the hobbyist community looked like at the time. This is within my lifetime. It's kind of amazing where we've gotten to. But within 6 years from this, the Super Bowl ad for the Big Brother Super Bowl ad would debut the Mac. Software would really be the king at that point. Mac OS would be introduced. Windows was there. Office productivity apps, games, lots more software. So commercial licensing quickly took over from this hobbyist community. And about this time, Richard Stallman, who was an academic working in the hobbyist and academic community, realized that this explosion of commercial software was actually a bit of a threat to the sharing-based economy for software, because new developments would be, you'd have to pay for them, and some of the efforts of the hobbyists would be co-opted without any return for their work. So this is an image of Richard. He came to Sri Lanka in 2008 to talk to the community there. And this was at the invitation of the Lanka Software Foundation, which was founded by Sanjeeva, kind of a precursor organization to WSO2. So Richard Stallman, he formed the Electronic Frontier Foundation, and he declared that software wants to be free, as in free beer. And that seems a little quaint in hindsight, but he really did the world a great service by developing the GPL license as one of the first important open source licenses. And the GPL encoded that sharing ethos of the community for the hobbyists and academics very well. It's sometimes called a share and share alike license. The GPL essentially says you're free to use my software as long as you share any improvements and derivatives of it back to me under the same license. So it's also become known as a copyleft license. It's a pun on copyright because it gives it means you can give someone software, kind of copying it to the right, but their derivatives come back to you, copied back to the left. So Richard applied the license to the libraries he was making available and that were incorporated into Linux. And so many of the critical projects that originated in those early days come with the GPL, such as Linux itself. And it really defines a self-reinforcing loop for free collaboration within the community. Commercial use or commercial profit really aren't the primary goals. So by the 90s, the commercial potential software was really quite apparent. Microsoft was emerging as the dominant player and showing clearly that software was more valuable than hardware. Especially as the cost of computing was dropping with Moore's Law, the value of software was going up. Businesses of all kinds were adopting personal computers and had appetites for software. Towards the end of the 90s, business itself was starting to undergo its first wave of digital transformation. With the early adoption of the web, every business all of a sudden needed to have websites. They were developing internal applications as web applications. So there are a lot of commercial users out there, and they really had two choices. They could purchase proprietary software, or they could use some of this free and open source software. So maybe your IT staff had just graduated from university. They were very familiar with open source software, and so they loved the promise of it, that you could use it for free as long as you were willing to maintain it. Gave them flexibility, low cost. And so commercial users began to join the ranks of the open source community as consumers of the software. Most of them didn't contribute back. It was more something where they could come find software and use it for free. So open source foundations such as the Apache Software Foundation blossomed, and that kind of foundation catered not just to hobbyists, but also to the commercial consumers and commercial companies partnering around the software. And it was a vendor-neutral forum where you could collaborate, potentially even with your commercial competitors. So the poster child for success of open source at the time has to be the LAMP stack, right? Linux for your operating system, Apache for your web server, MySQL for your database, PHP for the language that you're writing your applications in. So at last we had a complete open source stack for developing and deploying this whole new exploding category of software called web applications. So commercial users are different than hobbyists. They're mostly seeking access to software. They're not trying to create it themselves. And a corporate employee has a lot of different concerns than a hobbyist. They have to deal with budgets, lawyers, legal review, maybe confidentiality and trade secrets. And they're operating in a competitive environment rather than a collaborative environment. So a license that required sharing improvements back was a bit risky. You might develop something that you thought was a competitive edge, and then you'd have to give it to your competitors. So even just acquiring software can be tricky. So these users really love to have a standardized license. So your legal could review it once, and you could adopt any software under that license. And they liked a widely adopted one, so the lawyers were very comfortable that other companies had been able to use the software. And so the Apache license fits the bill nicely. It's a very permissive license. You can use the software. You can build on it without having to share it back. You can actually incorporate it and relicense it into a proprietary license. So the Apache license was very much preferred by these DIYer communities. Well, the success of the LAMP stack really dominated the kind of new category of web applications, and the traditional software players were kind of blindsided by this new source of competition from open source. And of course, when you see something disrupting, then entrepreneurs get involved, venture capital gets involved, and especially in the early 2000s after the .com bubble had kind of burst, there's a lot of appetite to find a new disruptive format for the software industry. And so by the 2000s, it looked like any commercial software category was potentially subject to disruption by open source. And a whole bunch of new startups were formed, and WSO2 was one of them. We thought open source was a great way to kind of break open the entrenched power of the traditional software vendors. So here's a picture of me with Sanjeeva on my first trip to Sri Lanka. Sanjeeva and his family, and this was 2006, just before I joined the company. And I kind of love the symbology here of, we have innovation coming from anywhere, out of the far corner of the world, just emerging from the jungle with a lot of power, ready to take on the traditional software players. And that's kind of powered by open source. And he even has a WSO2 logo on his shirt. I didn't Photoshop that in. That just happened in the photo. So, our founding premise for this disruption was that open source models were just a better way to create and develop and to distribute software. And we could use that somehow as a foundation of a commercial business. And we were focused, of course, on web services integration, and the big competitors at the time were IBM, Oracle, TIBCO, some of the big entrenched players. And we weren't alone. There were many other companies forming at the same time, both in our domain and in every other conceivable niche. And this is a very different community than the DIYers, who were mostly consumers. These were commercial ventures that were rapidly creating lots of open source and putting it out in the community. So the disruptors, leveraging open source to create great products and open up competitive spheres, it was just a great way to get a company off the ground. You have a very tight relationship between your users and your developers. So you can very quickly optimize your market fit. You get kind of free testing because you have a lot of users out there who will file bug reports back to you. And then just the word of mouth. The the power of being able to search for open source enterprise service bus gave us parity with searching for IBM ESB or Oracle ESB at the time. And because the target customer is a business, a permissive license is still a very appropriate one, and we still use Apache 2 license for almost all of our products to this day. And there, some companies provided slightly different licenses, including like if you had a GPL license code base, you could use something called a dual license strategy to provide an alternate commercial license for people who were a little wary of the copyleft terms in a GPL. So that was one other way you could bridge different licenses for the business community you were selling to. So some of these disruptors became segment leaders, but building a commercial business on the foundation of giving away free, permissively licensed software is a challenge. And you can monetize adjacent opportunities to the software. Things like you can add maintenance and support services like WSO2 did. You could add training and consulting services. You could operate the software for them. But you have to make sure that those are independently valued, because if people don't like your paid services, they're free to just use your software for free. So there's a lot of companies in the 2000s in the open source space, but very few of them were able to create a long-term sustainable model. So by the 2010s, I'll call them the peddlers. And I think many of the disruptors were really starting to run into the obstacles in generating profits from their business. Venture capital that had backed the land rush in the 2000s were starting to look for return on investment and starting to pressure these companies to turn their market share presence or dominance even into actual profits. And that was proving quite hard. The network effects means that there was consolidation, or even some of the companies went out of business, of course. So there's lots of great software out there, but the number of businesses that were successful was getting smaller. And you can kind of see what was happening during this decade with the high number of exits of a lot of these companies. A lot of them were acquisitions, even some of the major open source brands, like MySQL. It's one of the pillars of the LAMP stack. It was bought by Sun, and then subsequently to Oracle. And you can imagine Oracle didn't really want to make that too powerful and compete with their proprietary alternatives. So you could see acquisition happening. There were companies that adopted an open core strategy like Cloudera. Cloudera is an interesting case because Hortonworks and Cloudera were both monetizing around the Hadoop project, open source Hadoop. Hortonworks was quite a pure open source model. They added essentially maintenance and support services. Cloudera instead did more of a open core, where on top of the open source, they built some very sophisticated monitoring and management software that was proprietary licensed. And so they were kind of competing in the space. And in the end, the open core model won out. Hortonworks was eventually acquired by Cloudera. MongoDB is another interesting, not really an exit on a incorporation sense, but from the open source community. They faced kind of predatory competition from Amazon, who took their software and began offering very reasonable and powerful software as a service offerings around it. And Mongo, to respond to that competition, changed from a pure open source license to what we'll call an available source license, which means it's really open source for most users, but it excludes or discriminates against a certain class of users. In this case, Amazon specifically, but in general, large open source or large cloud providers that could compete too aggressively without supporting the ecosystem. Mule is an example of a company that was successful with open source, but then were successful in creating SaaS versions of that and selling the SaaS versions. And even so, with that kind of open core model or the SaaS model, they were acquired by Salesforce eventually. And of course, you can't miss that the most successful open source company, Red Hat, was acquired as well by IBM. So each of these companies generated some wealth for their founders, but they didn't really survive as independent companies at least within a pure open source model. So kind of characterizing this generation as the peddlers, it's really companies trying to find business models that work, really trying to find the balance between open/free software and closed/paid software. And it's a balance that every open source company has, and the pressures are different depending on the niche that you're in. So at WSO2, I think we've been very lucky and rather rare in finding a sweet spot that gives us the ability to keep our software generally open and still generate both reasonable growth and profits to reinvest in the R&D. So I think the biggest trend that's diminishing the prospects for the open source business was really the emergence of the next disruptor, which was SaaS. So SaaS clearly has some advantages over open source. You don't have, it hides a lot of the complexity of scalability, security, the management of the software. It's instantly available. Go to the website, you're hooked up immediately without having to install or provision your software. So there's a lot of benefits from SaaS, and the entrepreneurs and the venture capitalists started on the SaaS revolution, which is every conceivable kind of software, can we turn it into a SaaS product? And some of the open source companies pivoted to SaaS as well. So the 2010s were really kind of disastrous for the hopes that an open source commercial business model would overtake proprietary software models in the business. So there just aren't that many companies like WSO2 that have had the structure, the cost structure, and a business model that allows them to continue to grow and thrive without compromising important parts of the open source vision. So that's going to lead us to today. One of the most exciting developments, I think, in open source is what I'll call the community organizers. Lots of projects are being spawned by companies and developed in a collaborative way. This graph is pretty dense, but it's activity on open source projects at the Cloud Native Computing Foundation. And up in the upper right, the blue bubble, the most active one is Kubernetes, which is one of the most important open source projects today. And it's a good example. Google, it originated Google. Google needed good infrastructure. They built some very interesting cloud native operating system technology, but they don't sell software. They sell ads, they sell search, they sell productivity apps and hosted services. So developing and maintaining the infrastructure is a very costly proposition for them. So they donated it to a neutral organization where they could collaborate with other like-minded organizations. So Google, Microsoft, Red Hat are the largest contributors to Kubernetes at this point. And it's one of many projects at the CNCF. So I'm really encouraged that this community collaboration is coming back to open source. It's kind of like the original spirit, except instead of individuals coming together in a club, it's corporations coming together in a structured and organization that has good governance, enforces fairness and equity among the members. And I think one of the most important parts of open source for this group is that governance model provided by that organization. So let's take a quick look into the future. I think it should be clear that open source has had a lot of influence on the industry, but it's not immune to the forces of the industry. Security is top of mind at present, and one of the ways that you get security is have a very tight centralized governance over your code development to make sure it's secure all the way down, which is really incompatible with highly distributed, collaborative development from open source. So the EU is approaching this problem through regulation. The Cyber Resiliency Act is in effect, and a lot of its provisions will be rolled out over the next couple of years. And it's kind of reasonable. They're saying insecure software is a product safety issue, and we want to make sure vendors are providing quality software, but they've included open source in that. And it imposes extra costs on a provider to document their security, to follow good practices, to maintain their software. And with open source, you don't have a revenue stream necessarily to fund that. So it's going to put some pressures on open source. So I kind of predict the CRA is going to, and regulation in general, is going to define some of the new constituencies for open source over the next decade. There's a lot of ways that companies might react to these pressures. They might, like the US has introduced a kind of voluntary certification program. There might be more interested in the stewardship organizations like the CNCF, which have the resources to maintain the compliance with the law. There might be options for public funding for open source projects to help offset some of the costs of compliance. So there's there's probably going to be a lot of tinkering with licenses to try and work around some of the provisions or make them less onerous. So it'll be interesting to see how that shakes out over the next few years. So anyway, I hope I'll wrap up. I want to kind of give you a glimpse of how open source has really changed over the years, all the different constituents that continue to join the ecosystem and work on it, and realize that open source isn't just a simple, static, here's what it is, here's what it does, but it's constantly changing in response to who is involved, and we'll continue to see that in the future. So thank you very much. I think I just hit my time.